They didn't remember her as a name. They remembered her as a smell. Smoke, a coil in the throat, damp wool, hot rope. And before that, before law learned to speak in fire, there was the soft percussion of bare feet on packed earth, a private rhythm the village pretended not to hear. The ledger does not care for music, it cares for order. So it wrote her down as femina, and beside it a word that should have been joy. Saltatio, dancing, a crime in a place where movement must be supervised, where the body must apologize for knowing itself. This is not a story about demons. It is a story about diagrams, about straight lines and the hands that draw them, about circles and what happens to the person who dares to make one. You know the famous trials, the ones with names wide enough for headlines? This is not one of those. This is a village tested, a church that learned to hear a drumbeat as a summons, a magistrate who learned that mercy is easiest when it looks like smoke. She danced in the square, and eyes followed the curve of her wrist the way moths follow a flame. She danced at the edge of the fields, and stalks bent in a wind that did not ask permission. She danced in the kitchen, where flour floated like snowfall, and for a moment grief forgot its chores. They will say she was burned for witchcraft. That is a generous lie. She was burned for making air seem capable of joy. Small towns keep two calendars, harvest and rumor. One feeds the body, the other feeds the courthouse. In the 17th century, in parishes stitched together by roads of mud and prayer, the rules were simple. Speak softly, buy modestly, move only in ways that do not teach anyone else to move. What the law could not control with words, it tried to control with posture. Witchcraft was a convenient vocabulary. It turned inconvenience into threat. A woman who laughed too loud at market? A temptation. A midwife with a steady hand? A mystery. A girl whose joy made other girls lift their eyes from the floor? A summoning. None of these accusations required proof. They required only arrangement. A sermon, a few nods, and ink. Dancing unsettled the furniture of authority because it rearranged bodies without permission. Straight lines turn people into ranks. Circles make them neighbors. A circle is a quiet revolution you can draw with your ankles. The village prized stillness because stillness looks like obedience from a distance. But stillness is also what grief demands when it wants to be worshipped. Anyone who moved in a way that suggested a second God, a God of breath and pulse, became a candidate for theology by trial. Her name traveled the way frost travels a field. First a pale edge, then a glittering logic, then the whole crop bowed. They did not ask what she believed. They asked who might follow her if she were allowed to keep moving. It was midsummer, the day when the sky forgets to dim and the earth speaks in colors. The square filled as if the season had poured its pockets out. Cherries, linen, copper coins, hymn-quiet smiles. A tambourine blinked in the sun. A drum woke in someone's hands. Only a step, someone said. Only once, someone warned. She took her place at the edge where the lamplighter's ladder leaned and old chalk had once marked a game. When the drum rolled, she lifted her hands as if remembering a recipe. Not seduction, not spectacle. A memory of how her mother taught her to sift flour without choking on the dust. The circle formed by accident, bodies pulled by gravity and something older. Two men grinned, embarrassed by their own ankles. A girl covered her mouth, eyes bright. A boy clapped off-beat and then found the beat, amazed that the world would meet him halfway. From the church steps, the priest watched, not with fury at first, with hesitation, like someone noticing a door has been left open. From the shop's shadow, the constable counted 1, 2, 3 turns, and then a look that could be translated as policy. Someone said, "Not here." Someone said, "Not now." No one said why. She finished the measure not because she was stubborn, but because music resents interruption. When she stopped, the air seemed to keep dancing for one more breath. It was enough. The square remembered itself. The square remembered her. By evening, the drum was already on trial. She fetched water from the well with a rope that bit her palms. She baked bread that rose like small suns. She sewed hems that turned ragged edges into decisions. She had a scar at the wrist where oil had kissed too eagerly, and a laugh so careful it sounded like someone avoiding a spill. Her father had died at Winter's Center. The house had learned to tell time by the way her mother sat. Grief, when it cannot speak, sends its message through muscle. Shoulders that forget how to lower, jaw that thinks the world is unchewable. She answered with movement because it was the one language the body recognizes as home. At night, after the embers relaxed, she would stand in the single clear square of floor and practice ways to be less visible. Smaller steps, fewer turns, hands that told the truth but only in parenthesis. She was not a rebel. She was a person making a treaty with air. I will carry your weight if you carry mine. She never called what she did dancing. That word belonged to festivals, to the men who could drink without being accused of seduction, to the respectable circles like wedding rings and processions. She called it finishing the energy that grief could not swallow, finishing the music left half set in the marketplace by the tambourine's last blink. Inside, she was all weather. Outside, she wore a sky meant to offend no one. Rumor is thrift. It uses whatever is at hand. In this case, a boy's dream, a woman's envy, a sermon looking for a spine. She spun near the fields, said a neighbor who had only seen the wind. My child woke crying, said another who didn't mention the fever. She smiled while she moved, said a man, as if smiles were invitations to crime. The priest found a verse about stumbling blocks and filled the rest with caution. Beware the body's impatience, he said, and patience suddenly meant waiting for permission to breathe. Heads nodded, not because they agreed, but because nodding is a kind of camouflage. The constable took notes the way crows collect buttons. Not for use, for possession. Gather witnesses, he was told. Witnesses are not for seeing, they are for arranging sight. Her mother heard the speed in the village's silence and placed a hand on her daughter's hair as if calming a horse. Walk with the wind at your back, she said, which in their dialect meant, let them think you are going where they want you to go. But rumor prefers a straight road. It will not be led in circles. It ran to the clerk's desk and knocked like opportunity. The clerk dipped his pen and wrote her down not as a person, but as a problem attractive enough to answer. By dusk, her feet were already noisy on paper. On paper, feet are never innocent. They came at dawn when houses are most obedient, a knock quiet enough to be mistaken for a dream, and then the door learned it had hinges. The constable and a second man whose job was to watch, a third man to carry the feeling of law. The clerk followed later because the clerk knows that the only real arrest is the one conducted in ink. They sat her on a bench made for repentance, asked her questions polished by repetition. Where did you go? Who accompanied you? What compelled you to move beyond the limits of modesty? She tried to answer the way one answers a child learning a new word, slowly, carefully. There was music, she said. There were neighbors. It was daytime. They corrected her. It was disorder. It was provocation. Daylight does not excuse rebellion. She said, I finished a rhythm that was started. They said, you summoned a rhythm that was forbidden. They offered mercy like a pre-written prayer. Confess and you will see leniency. Confess to what? To knowing my own breath? To asking my bones to remember they are not furniture? The room grew colder because rooms do. When the conversation wants to be a contract, the keys clinked to remind everyone of their roles. The clerk cracked his knuckles, which is how paper clears its throat. When they left, the bench remembered her weight. The ledger remembered nothing. Ledgers are trained to forget. Trials like these are performed to instruct furniture. The table learns who may lean. The door learns when to remain closed. The citizens learn what happens when heir is accused of trespass. Witnesses filed in with the humility of people who enjoy being necessary. The vendor who sold her flour once. The midwife who had checked pulses for 30 years. The friend who knew the sound of her laughter from the next street. The vendor said she taught a boy a tune that would not leave his mouth. The court wrote, entrancement. The friend said, she moved as if the wind were an instrument. The court wrote, companionship with invisible forces. The midwife said, she has scars from work. The court wrote, marks consistent with diabolic contact. The midwife tried to argue the difference between labor and legend. The judge thanked her for her contribution to clarity and asked her to sit. No one lied. That is the excellence of such proceedings. No one must. The truth is rearranged, not replaced. A smile becomes a proposition. A clap becomes an invocation. A girl becomes a story someone else has been dying to tell. She watched the room watch itself. She realized that the problem was not that they hated movement. It was that they could not bear to see it unassigned. If she had danced for them, they would have forgiven everything. The clerk sharpened his quill, which is how a court practices its smile. They searched her the way superstition searches careless of dignity and hypnotized by coincidence. A birthmark became cartography, a bruise became literature, a blister became correspondence from the underworld. "Do you feel anything when you dance?" The woman tasked with inspection asked, whisper soft, as if speaking to a wound. "Relief," she said. The woman nodded, then wrote down pleasure, because one is admissible, the other is useful. They measured her posture as if obedience had a geometry. Shoulders too steady, defiance. Eyes too level, insolence. Breath too regular, spell. They wrote that she moved too easily through crowds, which indicated unnatural influence. They wrote that she did not faint in the chamber, which indicated unnatural calm. They wrote that she refused the language provided, which indicated possession by a grammar not approved by the church. They wanted evidence to live on the skin because skin is easy to condemn. They did not want to follow the evidence into the air, where anyone might find it and be forgiven. She understood then that the trial was not about evil, but about choreography. They wanted to teach the village how to gather, and the lesson required a dancer who could be canceled. When they sent her back to the bench, the room exhaled. The bench too. The verdict came dressed as ceremony, which is to say it hid its teeth with velvet. Words like edification and purity were arranged into a necklace, heavy and beautiful enough to distract. The judge spoke as if delivering weather, not judgment. "For the good of the community," he said, and you could see the community sigh with relief at being named good. They asked her to confess once more, the way a drowning man asks for a story to distract him from water. She said nothing, not because she was brave. To hear had already been told without her. The sentence borrowed the language of sanctity to legitimize its appetite. Cleansing, they called it, as if fire were a laundress with kind hands. Example, they added, as if cruelty were a lantern. Her mother's breath made a sound a living person should not make. The friends stared at the floor, where dust performed a mercy. If you looked long enough, it blurred the room. The clerk rolled sand over the ink. The document dried like a wound deciding what kind of scar to be. It was done, not because it was right, but because it was written. They prefer mornings for these things. The light is honest, and the shadows have no ambition. A bell rang with the sincerity of a tool. We will not describe the structure or its appetite. We will not count the faces pretending not to count. It is enough to say she walked as if remembering new steps heel, then toe, then ground. The earth at least held no grudge. Someone asked if she had last words. She considered wasting none. Then she thought of the tambourine, a bright coin of sound. She hummed 2 notes, the way a person hums to a child at the door, a lullaby that knows the road will hear it longer than the child will. A hush came over the square. Not reverent, not afraid. A hush that sounded like a page turned before the ink was dry. She lifted her chin not to defy the judge, but to look at the roof line, where swallows carved their ordinary miracles into the morning. It comforted her to see creatures that moved without permit. What happened next has been written elsewhere 1,000 cruel ways. You can imagine the smoke. You know what fire does. You do not need to be taught how a crowd decides to be many instead of one. When it was over, the wind took what it could, which is all wind ever promises. 2 days later, the clerk added a line. Sentence carried out. The ink behaved. The sand obeyed. The ledger congratulated itself on its capacity for closure. The square learned a new rule. No public dances after dusk. Not because dance is evil, but because it is difficult to supervise without daylight. The rule pretended to protect. Rules like this always do. Her mother folded a dress into a shape that suggested a person might fit it again. She placed it in the chest under the window, where the smell of soap and wood was courageous enough to persist. Her friend bit a thread to cut it and felt blood in her mouth. She did not spit. Spitting would have made the blood public, and she was tired of offering anything to the air. Children hummed the tune she had taught them when they were alone, the way children do when they do not wish to be corrected by love. The priest preached on a verse about wheat and tares. He did not mention fire. Fire prefers its own publicity. The constable slept. The judge did not. The midwife delivered a child that night and told the mother to breathe the way a dancer does when the floor becomes a partner. No one said her name because no one had been given one. The village found it convenient that grief without a noun is easier to file. You know the beautiful lies we tell about history. that the important things leave big footprints, that justice is large enough to be seen from far away, that cruelty at least has the decency to name itself. But the quiet trials are the ones that do the teaching, the ones where a parish decides to become a machine, where fear is efficient, where a girl is turned into a rumor so successfully that not even her enemies can remember what they called her. This is why you never heard. Because no pamphlet was printed, because no pamphleteer became a martyr for free speech, because the square returned to buying onions and wool, and the only sign that anything had happened was the absence of a tambourine. Because the story fits too well, it slides into other centuries without snagging. A supervisor who dislikes the way an employee laughs, a teacher who calls a child too much, a city that moves police into a park when music begins to gather strangers into a circle. We congratulate ourselves on living after witchcraft and fail to notice we continue to prosecute choreography. Her case is not a parable. Parables end with instructions. This ends with an invitation. When you see a body move with unlicensed joy, protect the clearing it creates. When you see a circle forming, ask what straight line has gone unquestioned too long. When you hear two notes hummed by someone at the edge of a room, hum a third. They burned a girl for dancing, and the wind refused to learn the lesson. It moves because it must. It does not apologize for being fluent. Say her name out loud, even if the only name you have is the one who moved. Say it as if breath were a kind of archive, as if air remembers what paper is paid to forget. When the drum begins, because it will do not ask whether it is allowed, ask whether you are.